We have an echo. Good afternoon, colleagues. Philippe Corrie from the Regional Office for Europe and Central Asia in Geneva. I see we have 40 connections, so very happy that many of you are interested by this first webinar discussion. We will try to be following the time in terms of having more time for question and answer at the end of our 4 presentations. So, and as you know, this is quite timely because we have the 30th anniversary of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. That will be bringing a lot of traction around the child rights agenda. Similarly, we have the Sustainable Development Goal agenda article, the goal 16 in particular, that really refers explicitly to the capacity of national human rights institutions as a key factor of success of this sustainable development agenda. And that's really timely as well because unfortunately the human rights agenda is not, first priority for many governments these days. So the more we will team up, the more we will share experience and best practices to ensure, the best defense of this human rights agenda, particularly child rights agenda, through strong national human rights institutions, the better it will be. So it's really what it is all about, the challenge we are facing. And I think these tools that have been developed in partnership with several experts and UNICEF around this national experience sharing, around this promoting and enriching existing partnerships around child rights with national human rights institutions, UNICEF, civil society, academia, and others would certainly be a good help. So without further ado, I would like to start with the first presentation that is going to be made by Vanessa Sedletsky, and the presentation is already on screen. And Vanessa is known to have worked, 15 years around the child rights agenda. She has worked a long time with UNICEF. She's truly an activist, and she's one of the author of this first, series of webinars, and particularly on this first series, the first webinar. So, Vanessa, are you on? Vanessa? Maybe you should unmute. Vanessa? We are locating Vanessa in the list of people who connected.
She's saying, "Can you unmute me?"
I can. Okay, so we are unmuting you, Vanessa. Can you speak now? We can't hear you, Vanessa.
Okay.
Oh, good. It's okay. Okay, you have the floor, Vanessa. We can hear you now well.
Great. So thank you and hello everyone. And together with Jerison, we'll introduce you to the tools we have produced for UNICEF Regional Office in Europe and Central Asia, but we believe they are applicable worldwide. But first, let me give you some precisions about the terminology we use. And if you can, thank you. In a given country, you might have a national human rights institution that covers all human rights for everyone in a country. It may be called a Human Rights Commission, a Human Rights Defender. And you will also have independent human rights institutions for children. And these can be 2 things. One, an ombudsperson for children or a child advocate that is a specialized institution focusing solely on children's rights, or a department within a national human rights institution with a specific focus on children's rights. And that would be, for instance, a deputy ombudsperson, a commissioner dedicated to children's rights or a child rights department. But the two important aspects is one, that an institution has a mandate that explicitly mentions children's rights or the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and two, that there is an identifiable department within that institution. So next, we have two main sets of international standards in this respect. The Paris Principles, which have been adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1993, and they focus on all national human rights institutions. And General Comment number 2, which was adopted by the Committee on the Rights of the Child in 2002, which gives an interpretation of the Paris Principle with a child rights lens. And we think it's particularly interesting to compare the two to understand what a child rights approach means. The main points we'd like to underline is one, the focus in the general comment of the CRC committee on accessibility to children, the participation of children, especially the most vulnerable, and this is an important aspect we address in the tools. The monitoring of not only public body as requested in the Paris Principles, but also private body, taking into consideration that children are often spend time in private settings. They might be in childcare institutions run by private associations. They might be in employment in private settings, and we need to be able to monitor their rights even there. And the third important point is that in the Paris Principles, the individual complaint mechanisms for these independent institutions is considered optional, while the CRC committee says it is a mandatory feature of those institutions because children face many barriers in seeking remedies to access and to claim their rights. So if we now look, next slide, at the CRC committee concluding observations, we see from experience that they have been decisive in prompting establishment processes worldwide. In virtually all countries where such an institution has been established, it was based on a recommendation by the committee that has been taken up by the government, willing to implement them, and also by partners on the ground who have been using the recommendations as an advocacy tool. So we have UNICEF is active, and a civil society organization also in promoting these institutions on the ground. Concluding observations also provide guidance for strengthening existing institutions, so that guidance might be tailored to specific country situations. But there are also some key aspects that we can see across concluding observations, and they reflect general comment number 2 in many ways. The importance of geographic coverage in the whole territory and accessibility to children. The need for adequate political, human, and financial support. Explicit monitoring of the CRC, of the implementation of the CRC as part of the mandate. And finally, dealing with individual complaints of child rights violation and the provision of remedies in a child-sensitive manner that also takes into consideration privacy, and that's a focus of one of the tools. So I'll now pass the word to Jerison, who will talk further about the tools and the child rights approach. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa. Jerison, the floor is yours. Can you hear us? Jerison, can you connect?
Okay, now I can. Okay.
Good, we can hear you.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay. So the rationale for the tool, which was commissioned by UNICEF, was to provide concrete and more detailed guidance to IHRIs on how to implement a child rights-based approach to their mandate, and to explore what were the challenges they faced in that work, what are the tensions and dilemmas, and to identify and suggest practical ways that those challenges could be addressed. And also to draw heavily really on illustrative examples from the field to highlight different ways in which institutions have taken that forward. So next slide. So what we've now produced is, in a way, phase one of the process, and we've developed 4 tools. One which we're talking about today, how to promote a child rights-based approach, and then 3 more tools, one on participation of children in the work of institutions, child-friendly complaints mechanisms, and how to achieve effective promotion and outreach. There has been a recommendation from a number of people that 2 additional tools would be helpful, one on advocacy, one on monitoring, which we'll be in discussion about over the next year. Next slide. So the methodology for developing the toolkit, the work was undertaken by a team of consultants, including Vanessa and myself, and has been supported all the way through with a reference group which had representation from IHRIs in the ICARO region, the ENOC, the European Network of Ombudsmen for Children, GANRI, and UNICEF. And we started off by in 2017 with an information gathering exercise, including an online survey to try and identify examples of practice in relation to outreach, complaints, participation across the ICARO region. And we also looked at additional examples from previous surveys which had been done in other regions. And those overall findings were used to develop the toolkit. And then the reference group has commented throughout the process on drafts. They have also provided illustrative examples of good practice. And we had a face-to-face meeting in Budapest last July to review the final drafts. So the drafts will be available now in hard copy, PDF, and eventually online. And the plan is to pilot them over the next year to assess how useful and practical they are. And we're hoping that individual IHRIs will be able to get them translated into their local language, hopefully with the support of UNICEF. Next slide. So each toolkit, each tool follows a similar structure. There's an overarching introduction to the topic, what it means, why it's important, what it involves, and then practical guidance on how to undertake that area of work with examples from the work across different regions from within institutions. There's then a section on challenges arising and how to address them. Looking at how to monitor and evaluate the work and the potential tools that can be used to support that process, and then a section on additional resources. Next slide. The tools are all rooted in a commitment to a child rights-based approach. And so that's rooted in the Convention on the Rights of the Child as the comprehensive and holistic framework governing all actions relating to children. And that means that IHRIs are encouraged to work towards ensuring that all of those rights are respected, protected, and fulfilled for every child. And they obviously include the provision rights, education, health, social security, and so on, protection rights, protection from violence, exploitation, and abuse, and participation rights, rights to birth registration, to freedom of assembly, to freedom of religion, privacy, access to information, and so on. Next slide. And it's important to understand, if you like, the interface between children's rights and the wider human rights that are seen for all people. So many of the rights are the same as for adults, but there are differences in the way that they are implemented for children. So, for example, if you look at the right to protection from economic exploitation, there are far more protections in place for children in relation to the age at which they can work, the amount of work, the arenas of work, the protections they need within that work, and so on. In terms of the right to information, which applies to all people, but for children there is an additional focus on material of having access to material of social and cultural benefit, and also guidance on how to protect them from harmful material. And then, of course, the CRC includes additional rights which are specific to children to reflect their age and greater vulnerability. So, for example, the concept of best interest, the rights to protection, alternative care, adoption, the right to play, focus on support for parental responsibilities and support for parents, and so on. And then finally, the CRC introduces this important concept of evolving capacities, which has significant implications for the parental role and for the process of transfer of rights from the parent on the child's behalf to the child themselves. So, for example, rights to consent to health treatment, sexual consent, and at the same time continuing protection from exploitation. And so it recognises the changing nature of childhood from 0 to 18 and will place an obligation on an IHRI to elaborate approaches in working with children to ensure the protection which is consistent with their age throughout that childhood period. Next slide. It embodies an assumption that the work is rooted on the core human rights principles: universality and inalienability, interdependence and indivisibility, transparency and accountability, and dignity. And next slide. But it also focuses very strongly on the four general principles which have been identified by the Committee on the Rights of the Child in relation to the CRC. So in relation to non-discrimination, human rights institutions need to ensure that their work reaches out to all children, especially the most marginalised, and need to address all forms of discrimination against children, including against them as a consequence of their age. So, for example, looking at status crimes such as running away from a care home, or the imposition of age-restricted curfews. The best interests of the child is a central building block of the CRC, and in the context of human rights institutions, the best interest principle needs to inform all of your work, including how children are treated within the institution as a principle to be applied in resolving complaints, in outreach and promotional work, and in advocacy at all levels. And it's a principle that needs to be recognised both in relation to individual children, but also children as a constituency. The right to life, survival and development is also a central concept of the CRC, that children carry within themselves the potential for their own development, but need positive and supportive environments to enable them to achieve their fullest potential. So the work of human rights institutions in relation to children needs to focus on holding governments to account in creating the environments in which children can achieve their optimum potential and ensure the realisation of their rights. And then finally, the right to be heard and taken seriously. As we know, historically, children have been treated as objects rather than subjects. They've been seen as merely recipients of adult protection and decision-making. But children need to be recognised as agents entitled to be actively involved in decisions that affect their lives. And IHRIs need to acknowledge the obligation to engage children at all levels in their work as an integral dimension of a child rights-based approach. Next slide. So in conclusion, children as people are obviously rights holders. Many of those rights are identical to those recognised for adults, but there are additional rights reflecting children's levels of maturity and vulnerability. All implementation and the work of the IHRIs must reflect the four CRC principles and children's evolving capacities. In order to do that, it's really important to work with as well as for children. And IHRIs clearly have a very critical role to play in promoting and monitoring those rights of children. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Jerison. I mean, again, thank you for your contribution to this toolkit. As a child rights expert, your experience, as a founder of the Child Rights Alliance in England, and your work with the Committee on the Rights of the Child has been certainly very useful in developing this toolkit. And again, thank you also to Vanessa as a co-author of this toolkit. Very much of value for our work to come. So now let's have another perspective from the Global Alliance of National Human Rights, extremely a very important institution that has a lot of leverage. And we have with us Catarina Rose and Liana Bello. So I guess that Catarina Rose will speak first from the Secretariat. Catarina, the floor is yours. Could you unmute? We don't hear you. Katharina? Could you unmute, Katharina?
Si jamais on n'entend pas Katharina, on peut donner le floor à Lena.
Okay, if we have a problem with connection with Katharina, first perhaps we could have Iana Bello from the Secretariat of the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions. Iana, could you start?
Sinon, Lena,
Iana?
Lena.
Hello?
Yes,
Afternoon,
please.
can you hear me? Yeah, it's Lena now from the German
Lena,
Institute for Human Rights.
Okay, thank you, Lena. Please go ahead.
Okay, maybe my colleagues from the Global Alliance will participate a little bit later and then can do some concluding remarks.
All right.
So I start now, yes?
Yes, please go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, I'm happy to present now the main outcomes of the global mapping of the work of NHRIs with and for children. GANRI and UNICEF have carried out a mapping of NHRIs' roles, activities, experience and needs in promoting and protecting children's rights. And the idea was to get an answer to the question, what exactly do NHRIs already do all over the world to promote and protect children's rights? And this mapping, it's a study, maybe I think you also all got the materials and can have a look at it later. It provides really a very rich outcome and gives a diversity of insights into good practices of NHRIs worldwide. In total, we have got answers, replies to the survey of 65 NHRIs from 65 countries. You can see here in the first figure the distribution regionally, Europe, Africa, Americas, and Asia and the Pacific. And you can see that in all regions, nearly half or more than half of all GANRI members replied to the survey, with the highest share in the Asia-Pacific region. There, 73% of NHRIs replied from that region, and the lowest share in Africa and the Americas. So all in all, the numbers of participants from each region are high enough to form a representative sample. And the whole study was actually carried out with a task force consisting of staff of NHRIs from the 4 regions and GANRI head office and UNICEF colleagues. So this task force fine-tuned and pre-tested the questionnaire and provided feedback on the draft study. Next slide, please. As we already heard of Vanessa, NHRIs have different institutional arrangements for their work on children's rights. Some have a dedicated department on children's rights, some have a division or unit, and some have a commissioner or even an ombudsperson responsible for children's rights. And they work on a variety of topics with regards to children's rights. What were the top topics NHRIs replied to the survey work on? You can see here it's violence against children and education. 77% responded that they would work on these 2 topics, followed by child-related legislation and rights of children in conflict with the law. In contrast to these topics, children's rights and the SDGs is a relatively new topic, which has developed traction only after 2016. But the fact that 20% of NHRIs already work on this topic is quite promising and leaves room for more engagement in the future. NHRIs have the advantage that they work on all kinds of human rights and other vulnerable groups, for example, such as LGBTI, elderly people, women, or people with disabilities. So they can interlink and mainstream child rights, for example, by focusing on girls' rights or children with disabilities or unaccompanied minors seeking asylum. Next slide, please. Thank you. Already mentioned was here general comment number 2 of the Committee on the Rights of the Child, which is important because it outlines the types of activities which NHIs should carry out to support the promotion, protection and monitoring of children's rights in light of the general principles of the Convention. And here you can see we actually asked in the questionnaire that NHIs were asked to assess whether they carry out certain activities and with what regularity they do so. And here in the bottom, activities are mentioned which NHIs do very regularly, and over two-thirds of NHIs carry out regularly. For example, 75% replied that they publish regularly reports, give opinions or recommendations on children's rights. 72% promote the general public's knowledge about children's rights. Other activities which require a lot of specific strategic planning and expertise, like inquiries and targeted human rights education, are undertaken with a little bit less frequency. They are listed in the middle of this pyramid, and these are, for example, 52% do regularly human rights education for relevant target groups with a focus on children. And then on top, we see that only few NHIs, less than 1/3, work on statistics and ensure that statistics on children are appropriately disaggregated. This were 28% of NHIs are regularly engaged in this activity. Yes, so in conclusion to that, very few NHIs have specialized staff or entertain regular relations with statistical offices where they exist. However, statistical competency is actually quite key to be able to monitor the progress or setbacks with respect to children's rights and SDGs, so there's still room for engagement. Then with regards to individual complaints, please next slide. It was also one topic in the study. The mandate to receive individual complaints is optional under the Paris Principles, but actually 86%, you see this green graphic of responding NHIs have this mandate and exercise this mandate as well, and only 8, so 12% do not so, and interestingly these 8 are all in Western Europe. And then there was the question, by whom are complaints brought forward? And it appears that most child rights related complaints are brought forward by caregivers and not by the children and young people themselves. This may be due to various reasons, of course. The data demonstrates that most NHIs classify complaints based on the issue. So, for example, child rights or women's rights, and not based on who brought the complaint in. So it would be actually also interesting to register the complaint by whom, register the complaint by whom it brought in, for example, in terms of age, disability, or any other status. So that might be a tool for assessing the accessibility and be important for NHIs. So that's regarding to individual complaints. Another important topic, which is also part of the of this webinar, is participation of children and young people in NHIs. We found out that most of the responding NHIs stated that they involve children and youth in their work. 23% did not respond or stated that they do not involve children. And here you can see the degree of children's participation. Hello?
Yes, please go ahead, Lena.
Yeah, okay. The degree of children's participation, and this differs quite considerably among NHIs. The majority.
Yeah, please continue.
Yeah, okay. The majority of NHIs invite children to their events and organize awareness-raising campaigns among children. And fewer NHIs involve children in research. There was, for example, quite an interesting example of the NHIs of the Philippines. They involve children in their child-related studies through interviews and focus group discussions. And very few NHIs work with advanced degrees of participations. Here you see that only 8 of the ones we asked, they have actually youth-led advisory councils to the NHIs.
Unless there's an issue over human rights.
Excuse me, if you are talking at the same time as the speaker, it's a bit confusing. So please have your mute button on if you want to talk to your colleagues when the presentation is made. Thank you for that. Please, Lena, can you continue? Sorry for that.
Yes, no problem. So only 8 of the NHIs who participated in this survey have actually youth-led advisory councils. There was, for example, the NHI in Serbia, which has a panel of young advisors with children from 13 to 7 years from all Serbian regions. So to conclude with regards to participation, NHIs actually clearly voiced that they have interest in learning more about participation as a topic and as well as the methodology. So now I come to my last slide and give some recommendations which were also mentioned in the study. To sum up, through their unique mandate of NHIs and unique functions under the Paris principles, which were presented in the very beginning of this presentation, NHIs can actually do quite a lot to contribute to the realization of children's rights. And the study has shown that NHIs are highly interested in increasing knowledge exchange, so to actually exchange with their regional partners. So one conclusion in this, one recommendation in the study is the promotion of cross-regional NHI cooperation, knowledge exchange of good practices. The study already identified good practices, but there should be a direct exchange between NHIs as well, and peer support to further strengthen NHIs as child rights actors on the ground through GANRI, and to foster regional exchange of good practices and training on regionally specific challenges. There were, I already mentioned, some training needs like statistics and SDGs and so, but there are some others mentioned as well. And topics through regional NHI networks. There are also regional NHI networks besides the Global Alliance. And there could be a strong collaboration and cooperation with regional UNICEF offices. NHIs have also identified some key challenges. One of it is insufficient financial resources. Another one is the lack of specialized staff with regards to child rights. And they are generally departments on children's rights or units or ombudsperson, depending how the formal structure is, could be strengthened in collaboration with UNICEF country offices further in the respective country and work together with the UNICEF country offices and the Department of NHIs working on children's rights. And then as a last recommendation, as I mentioned, there were some capacity development needs identified, and these could be tackled through trainings in statistics, monitoring, linking child rights monitoring with SDG monitoring, and another topic, children's participation in monitoring and research. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lena. Very, very useful. I mean, this global mapping is particularly valuable, and the insights you shared with us is also very useful. Particularly, the call for more participation of children in NHI. I mean, I think it's really something we could foster easily, but certainly meaningfully and actively. So, I don't know if Katarina is online or Yana Bello. From the Secretariat of the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions. If you are not back, I know you have some technical problem. We'll move forward to the next presentation with Edita Ziobene. with a bureau member of the ENOC that you all know, and sharing also a perspective, regional perspective to be more specific, and the challenge.
Hello, good morning.
Yes, is it, hello? Is it Edita Ziobene?
Hello.
Yeah.
Good morning.
Yeah, Edita, please go ahead with your presentation, and then we try to reconnect you with the other speakers, Katarina and Jana, later on. Huh? Please, Edita, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, let me thank you for this possibility that we have possibility to share our views from the ombuds institutions. I think our network, ENOC, is very important for every European ombudsman institution. Our network unites 42 institutions in Europe, in 34 countries. It means in some countries we have more than one ombuds institution. The network unites all independent ombudsman institutions. Independence is one of the key issues for all our institutions. It means autonomous decision making, independent budget, of course, clear appointment system. So this network unites institutions, and we try to have in the network every year annual meeting with annual topic. Usually we vote together what kind of challenges we have and what kind of annual topic we would like to choose. For this year we have topic digital rights or children's rights in digital world. Before we had education, sexual education, violence, and other very, just say, challengeable topics. As a network, we try to share our experience and to share good and bad practices in our institutions and our countries. This sharing is very important because every year we have some new colleagues, newly appointed colleagues in the countries, and we see that understanding of children's rights, even level of children's rights protection, is very different. First of all, I would say that our institutions are very different. It varies from national human rights institutions who have in their mandate children's rights, also general ombudsman institutions who have deputies for children's rights, or separated just only for children's rights established institutions. Also, our mandates are very different. Some of our institutions are investigating complaints, others are just observing or just only promoting children's rights. So mandates are very different. And we also try to do every year, we call it spring seminar, try to establish different competences. I would like really to thank UNICEF and other institutions who are preparing different tools on children participation, on children opinion, how to involve children in different activities, also how to listen to children's opinions, and also how to make children-friendly systems like justice or complaint mechanism and other mechanisms, what is very important for our institutions. Also, we try to observe other institutions like Council of Europe, what they are doing on children's strategies, also CRC activities. So we try to share our best experiences. Challenges what we see in our countries, of course, it's how to secure our independence in the countries, and also how to avoid political influence. We see even that in all democracies, countries, sometimes it happens that with changes of political coalitions in government, or with different values, I would say, in the countries, sometimes we see that ombudsmen have problems with their real independence, also with their financial insecurity, and sometimes with uniting institutions, sometimes with just say positive or negative challenges. So problems exist in the countries, but we try to solve together. And sometimes our colleagues are feeling like bridges for society and NGOs, but sometimes we feel like left alone in our countries, and sharing of our experiences among us, it's very important. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Edita. Extremely helpful. Indeed, the network of ombudsperson is particularly important in steering public opinions around child rights, and also better understanding from governments and other institutions at various levels around child rights within societies. So a very important role played by the ombudspersons. So I don't know if Katarina is back from the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions. If you are back, Katarina, please, the floor is yours. Katarina?
Yes, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear. Please go ahead.
Excellent, and I'm here with Iliana, who is the GANVI Operations Manager. We are both based in Geneva at the head office of the Global Alliance for National Human Rights Institutions. Many greetings to everyone. We wanted to have a few words around the roles that national human rights institutions are playing. They are, as you know, independent institutions of the state and are regularly established by law or by constitution, and would be governed by what we call the United Nations Paris Principles, which have been adopted in 1993 by the United Nations General Assembly. And these Paris Principles establish the minimum requirements to those institutions to ensure that they are independent and effective in their work in promoting and protecting human rights on the ground. So among those requirements, IHRIs should have a broad human rights mandate, meaning covering all the spectrum of human rights, and also specific functions and powers. And very often those national human rights institutions are referred to as a bridge, or as having a bridging role, both between the international and the national levels, because they have a mandate and a very important contribution to make in ensuring that the international human rights treaties, but also recommendations coming out from the UN and from regional mechanisms are translated into realities on the ground, but also have a very important role in informing those mechanisms about the national human rights situation in the specific country. Secondly, also a bridge between all different actors of society and across society as a whole, because they are placed They have a very central position within their respective societies and can play an important bridging role between the government and communities, rights holders, and particularly also have a role to reach out to those furthest behind. And then thirdly, also across rights, and this really thanks to the broad mandate that they have, they're able to look into a variety of rights and connect and interlink those rights in the work that they carry out. So because of this both central situation and the mandate and functions that they have, IHRIs are really very uniquely placed to work on children's rights. Obviously, as has been said also by the previous speaker, their mandates may differ from one institution to the other, and also the type of institution, how they've been established, may differ. But all of them would have responsibilities and mandates in terms of human rights education and awareness. They would have a mandate to advise, to provide legislative and policy advice to ensure compliance with international human rights treaties and CRC in particular. They would have a mandate to carry out investigations, inquiries, and more generally to monitor the national human rights situation. And they would also have a mandate to report on the situation, both at the national level, so for example to Parliament, for example, through their annual reports, which are also public, but then also, as I mentioned before, to the United Nations and the regional human rights protection system to alert and inform those bodies about the situation on the ground. And some institutions, although this is not a requirement, a specific requirement on the Paris Principles, would have a complaints handling mandate as well. And two other, I think, very relevant requirements in terms of child rights is also the requirement of IHRIs needing to be accessible to rights holders on the ground, meaning that their complaints handling mechanisms and all their procedures need to be accessible to the variety of stakeholders and rights holders that they serve, including children, and also to be pluralistic in their composition, to ensure that the institution is really reflective of the society as a whole and can really have that link and that bridging role with society, with the communities and the rights holders. And just a few final words about what GANRI is, the Global Alliance of IHRIs. What we do as global network of all these national human rights institutions is to help and support IHRIs to do the important work that they do domestically. We are the global platform for them to get together and to exchange knowledge and experiences, to learn from each other, to share lessons, and also really to collectively identify what constitutes a good practice, and how really can we implement the Paris Principles. What does it mean to implement the Paris Principles in practice, and specifically vis-a-vis child rights, for example. We also do accreditation of IHRIs. We support IHRIs in their engagement with the United System. We also serve as a global voice of all national human rights institutions to inform global policy development, speaking collectively as GANRI. And then we carry out also a variety of capacity building programs and other support programs to our national human rights institutions on specific topics and themes. And I think I'll hand over now to Iliana to add a few words. Thank you very much.
Hi, hello, thank you, Katarina. Just very briefly, perhaps on the collaboration between UNICEF and GANRI. At the country level in IHRIs and UNICEF, the cooperation at the country level is very well established. At the global level, GANRI and UNICEF worked together since few years through different events, including a seminar that was organized at the time of the annual meeting of GANRI back in 2017, focusing very much on the work of national human rights institutions, specifically on complaint handlings and on work on SDGs and children's rights. And the role of GANRI as a knowledge broker within its member, it's what has somehow gave us the, together with UNICEF, the idea of doing the mapping that you see now on the screen on children's rights in national human rights institutions. And as GANRI, we would like to continue this collaboration with UNICEF, which we value a lot, and considering the interest and the work that national human rights institutions are dedicating specifically on children's rights, and at the national level, the work they do in collaboration with UNICEF and also with civil society organizations. We hope that this will continue and also be strengthened through a series of tools also that GANRI is putting in place, including a knowledge management platform where we hope that IHRI can also exchange on their work on children's rights. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for giving the perspective of the Global Alliance. Very, very interesting. So now we have more time for question and answer sessions. What would be helpful is to have all our people connected online to write their questions, and we will from Geneva, select the questions so that we have a diversity of questions. So some might be responded directly by Vanessa and Jerison, and some might be specifically targeting, some of the presentation we just had. So we start with the first questions while you are putting your own questions online. With Fanny, please, could you read the question?
So the first question came from Bhaktya, and the question goes like this. So how can children take their case or complaint to monitoring bodies such as the Human Rights Committee? So this was a question that came from Bhaktya. So I suppose Vanessa can take this question on.
Yes, I'm not sure I can fully answer for the Human Rights Committee, but definitely for the Child Rights Committee, there is now a third optional protocol in force on an individual communications procedure. And in the preamble of the optional protocol, the role of national human rights institutions and specialized institutions like similar independent institutions, so that would include ombudspersons, is mentioned as critical. And individual complaints can be brought either directly by children or on behalf of children. And on behalf of children would need to have the victim's approval. So we could envisage a role for independent institutions if they want to take a case to the CRC committee. Technically they could with the child's consent, unless it's in their best interests not to give their consent. I'm talking here in general. The other way those institutions can support children is by informing them and informing families about this opportunity, giving them information about how to access the Committee on the Rights of the Child, and support them in preparing their case. There is also this idea that if a child has complained to has filed a complaint to the independent institution and has not obtained, or the solution hasn't been found either by the institution or because the recommendations haven't been followed up upon by the state, they could also go to the CRC committee. Thank you. I think Anne is in the room, so Anne Grandjean, if you'd like to add something, please don't hesitate.
Yes, thank you, Vanessa. No, I think you've said it. Just maybe worth mentioning is that while there are many complaints that have already been shared with the committee and being considered, the vast majority of them were dismissed because of procedural inconsistencies, let's say, and there were only 2 decisions made so far by the committee. So it's a slow and long process, but obviously it's great that this is possible. Since I have the floor, maybe I'll proceed with sharing the second question that was asked by Eslu in Kazakhstan, and the question is as follows: do child rights ombudspersons who have a separate office to NHRIs undergo accreditation in compliance with the Paris Principles when the country already has an accredited NHRI?
That would be perhaps for Katarina to provide an answer. Katarina?
Yes, with pleasure. I've noted that there have been 2 other similar questions, also one from Chile and one from Romania, relating also to accreditation. So the accreditation that is undertaken by GANRI under the auspices of the United Nations is done on the basis of the Paris Principles, which I've mentioned before. And one of the requirements of the Paris Principles is for those NHRIs to have a broad human rights mandate. So considering that they would need to cover any human rights issue coming up in the country with this broad human rights mandate. So where we do have, as is the case, for example, in Chile and in Kazakhstan, where we do have an accredited national human rights institution, but also a child's rights ombuds institution, or indeed another specific thematic or geographic institution that has a specific mandate, then we would very much encourage, obviously, those two institutions to work together very closely and coordinate their activities. For example, one recommendation that we have been issuing to our accredited national human rights institutions is to see whether the child ombuds institutions or other ombuds institutions in the country could be members ex officio of the IHRI to ensure a very close institutional and work relationship among the institutions.
Thank you, Katarina. Another question, please, Penny.
We've got a question from Aren, and she's asking how can IHRIs reach out to you, and that is Ganri, for any support or capacity building on human child rights issues.
So perhaps a question for Katarina or Yina.
Yeah, perhaps just to say that we, as I mentioned briefly before, we are putting in place a knowledge management platform, which is an online platform for the sharing of good practices and also online training. So far, we did not develop any specific online training on children's issues, but it could be, if there is an interest coming from IHRIs to create a community of practices around this topic, we would be glad to facilitate that. And this is also a way, certainly, to build the capacity through the sharing of information, reports, documents, videos, etc., and enhance the collaboration of IHRIs around children's rights.
Thank you, Yina. Another question, please, Anne.
Mm-hmm. There's another question coming from Kazakhstan asking if there is a record of the tools for IHRIs in monitoring of child rights in residential institutions or other state and non-state services, including the names of the countries who would be using them and where to find them.
So perhaps a question for Leila, maybe the mapping.
Yeah, but the mapping didn't really cover, unfortunately, to ask for special tools of monitoring. Let me just see the question. Children's well-being. It only asked about the activities. So if NHIs do it or not. So then the next step would be to have this community of practices which were mentioned, or some kind of, I don't know, UNICEF, NHI seminars or whatever, and then exchange tools. But the mapping didn't identify special tools.
Thank you. Maybe Jerison? No problem.
I mean, as far as I'm aware, there isn't any generalized tool that's available for monitoring that's used by NHRIs. I mean, there's obviously the guidelines on alternative care, which provide a set of globally approved and recognized standards for the situation of children who are living away from home and living in institutional care, which could be used as the basis for a monitoring tool. But I'm certainly not aware that such a tool has actually been developed as yet. But it's an interesting question, and something that maybe needs thinking about.
I actually wonder, isn't there a tool by Defense for Children International on how to monitor places of detention?
Yes.
Yeah, that could maybe be related.
Yes.
Good point. Thank you. Fanny, another question?
Yeah, we have got a question here from Moldova. And they are asking of any examples of involvement of the Child Rights Ombudsman in regular monitoring of the implementation of the CRC recommendations which may be complementary to the reporting to the CRC.
So, Edita, would you like to respond to that?
Sorry, may I ask you just to repeat your question?
Yes, please.
Yeah, any examples of involvement of the ombudsman
in CRC activity?
Yeah, any examples of involvement of ombudsman regular monitoring of the implementation of the CRC, including recommendations or any complementary reports that are made to the CRC?
Usually we recommend for our colleagues to observe what happens in their country and also participate. Sometimes we choose to write alternative report, like shadow report for CRC on children's education in the country, and also participating not in governmental position, but just observing the procedures in CRC, and also participating actively in the country, what happens after recommendation, how recommendations are implemented in the country.
Thank you, Edita. Another question, Anne?
Yes, there's a question coming from Bengo Donex. I hope I'm saying your name correctly. And the question is whether, I mean, it's more a comment actually. In my view, NHRIs that meet Paris Principles category A probably should be given space at the Committee on the Rights of the Child as a motivation during the reviews of state party reports. Well, maybe I can answer that one, yeah? So actually, NHRIs have a very important role in the review by the Committee on the Rights of the Child in terms of offering alternative views to the state party report. And I guess that's important that they do maintain that independence and are able to provide that separate alternative view. They submit confidential report to the committee, and the committee take these views into account when preparing for the official dialogue with the government delegation. So they do play a role, not as part of the government delegation, obviously, but as an alternative player in that process.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much.
Maybe I could add, it's Lena.
Please, Lena, go ahead.
I would, yes, that's actually true. In the case of Germany, for example, the German Institute was invited in the pre-session on Germany, and we as an NHI, we had also a time slot for speaking. So it was besides NGO, so the National Coalition on Children's Rights in Germany, that was the NGO part, who had a speaking slot, and then we also as an NHI to provide our perspective and in front of the committee, and we got into dialogue with them. So just to add there.
Thank you, Lena. Feni, another question or comment?
Yeah, I see like two comments requesting this kind of webinar to be held in Spanish, and these asks are actually going to UNICEF. So perhaps Manuel can respond if there is a possibility of having this kind of webinar in Spanish at a time X in the future.
Thank you, Fanny. So I think we try to respond also in writing to that question. I think that's a valid one, and we'll try to explore this and come back to colleagues specifically from that region, from the Latin American and Caribbean region. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Any other questions, comments? So last time, let's go for it. So if you want to have a question, it's time to send it in writing. I'll give you 1 minute for that. So we don't see any questions or comments coming in. So thank you so much to our speakers. It was there is one question. Please go ahead, Anne.
Okay, so that question comes from Stacy at the Consortium for Street Children, and the question is, I believe you mentioned a lot of the NHRI engagement with children. Was that a lot of these engagements was through their caregivers? how a network works with street children. Do you know of any example of effective engagement with NHRIs with children who don't have parents, guardians, or live in traditional household settings?
So maybe a question, maybe Lena, did you find out, since you raised the issue of participation of children with human rights institutions? Lena?
Yeah, participation of children, yes, of course, and individual complaints as well, if children or caregivers were carrying out the complaints, but I think it was not that detailed here. The question is on engagement of NHIs with children who don't have parents or caregivers, guardians, yeah? So the study did not look at that specific topic.
Okay.
Go ahead. I can just answer quickly that there are some experiences, as far as I know, mostly of ombudspersons, but I think we might also find some in some countries like Afghanistan, where the Human Rights Commission has been very active. Certainly in Ireland, the Ombudsperson for Children has done some work on research with unaccompanied minors, so without parents, obviously, with them. I'm not sure about children living and working on the street. We would need to investigate that, but there are definitely experiences out there in this area.
And if Vanessa, if I can just add, there's a very interesting example also from the Australian Human Rights Commission. They published a study into unaccompanied children, migrant children in Australia, and have been using the inquiry mandate, as we've been mentioning before, to actually conduct interviews with children, to meet with them, to in order to really find out what is the situation. And they've been having a lot of impact to raise public awareness and inform the public opinion about the human rights of these children that are unaccompanied. They've been, for example, working very closely with the media to raise public attention around that, and have been making very concrete recommendations to the government on how to address this very concerning situation.
Thank you very much. If there are no further questions at this point, I'd like really to thank the speaker and all the participants online, and thank you for the good questions and comments. Obviously, this is a living tool, and so we encourage you to provide us with feedback so that we can even target it better for all of us, and share it through your network and constituencies. That's something that could be used more broadly than it is today. I mean, this is all about building partnerships, leveraging support across networks within respective countries. So really something that we should push for. And then, we will have, as you know, a series of 3 more webinars to come for this endeavor. And the first coming webinar will be on Wednesday, 13th of March at 7 a.m. New York times. And for the early birds in the North American continent, but for children, I think everybody can wake up early. And then this one will be focusing on human rights institutions and the promotion of outreach with children. So that will be the focus. Human rights institutions and the promotion and the outreach with children, Wednesday, 13 March, 7 o'clock a.m. New York times. The following webinar, which will target, and we discussed about that through our webinar today, human rights institutions and child participation. A very interesting topic, because a lot, as we have learned from Lena's recommendation, a lot is still to be done. So a very interesting webinar on this issue on Tuesday, 16 April at 7 o'clock New York times. Again, an early bird, but useful webinar on an important issue. Human rights institution and child participation. And the last but not the least webinar will be held on Wednesday, 15 May at 7 o'clock New York times, and will focus on human rights institutions and child-friendly complaints mechanisms. which was also referred by Lena in our global mapping as an important issue to work on together. So certainly an important moment to try to move forward on this particular area. So big thank you to all of you, particularly to our speakers, and to your interest in following these webinars. Again, it's only when we unite, when we connect our network, combine our outreach, that will make a difference collectively. At a time you have, challenged and rough seas for the human rights agenda, including the child rights agenda. So this type of approach is particularly, I would say, crucial and vital. And we have to also deliver on a commitment, SDG 16, around the importance of the capacity of independent human rights institutions. So therefore, very much relevant for the global agenda that the international community has committed to, and certainly by connecting all these networks, whether they are the Child Rights Committee experts, the Global Alliance, the National Alliance for Children's Rights, the Ombudsperson network, is of the essence of this type of discussions. Thank you all, and let's meet again on Wednesday, 13 March at 7 o'clock New York Times on the human rights institutions and promotion and outreach of children. Thank you. Bye bye. Au revoir. Hasta luego.
Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye bye. Thanks.
Bye bye. Thank you.
Bye bye. Thank you.
Mm.